Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Burnt Pancakes podcast. I am your host, Katie Fensky. I'm on a mission to remind moms that everyone burns their first pancake. It is summer vacation. My kids are crazy. They're home. So I'm going at this with another solo podcast. Recently, I was interviewed on another podcast about my VBAC experience. So I got to share that. And I realized that I don't think I've really talked about that much on this podcast. And whenever I do bring this up to other moms, I have lots of women say, "Oh my God, I'd love to hear your story," because either I'm interested in doing that in a future pregnancy, or they just don't know that it's an option. So for today's podcast, I just want to share what my VBAC experience was like. So for those of you who don't know, a VBAC stands for vaginal birth after cesarean. I'm going to give you a few stats about this and then kind of tell you about how this came to be for me. So the American Congress of OBGYNs recommends VBACs as a safe option for most women who have had a previous C-section. The success rate of VBACs is between 60 to 80%. VBACs often carry fewer risks than a repeat cesarean and can offer a shorter recovery time and hospital stay and a higher chance of successful breastfeeding. In the United States in 2022, about 31% of live births were cesarean deliveries, and the rate of vaginal births after cesarean, so VBACs, at that time was 14 per 100 live births. So when I had my first, the reason I had a C-section is because Ronin was breech. So I was probably, I don't even think I was 30 weeks pregnant yet. I went in for one of my regular routine appointments, and the doctor was feeling my stomach, and she goes, "Oh, this is his head, like up at the top." And I always felt like a really hard lump right at the top of my belly. And I thought it was his butt. Turns out it was his head. And so they did an ultrasound and they were like, "Yeah, he's breech." I mean, this still seemed very early on. It was before I was 30 weeks pregnant. But she was so like nonchalant and was like, "Oh, okay, you'll probably have a C-section. That's just probably how it's going to happen. I've done this all the time, and babies usually don't flip at this point." And here I am, a first-time mom, thinking that I'm going to have a normal delivery. And it was like gut punch. Like, wait, what? Like, you're saying I'm going to have a C-section? And I think at the time we had already done our hospital class. It was like a 5-hour class on a Friday night at the hospital. And in that class, they stated some fact that like at their hospital, like really high number, like 75% of deliveries were C-sections. But the amount of time they actually spent on how to prepare and what it's going to be like was probably like 4 minutes of the entire 5-hour class. So it was very interesting. Like, I didn't even pay attention because I'm like, I'm not having a C-section, whatever. And then here my doctor tells me, "You're going to be having a C-section." I was in denial for a while. I was like, no way do I have these big birthing hips for no reason. Like, I am taller. I've always had wide hips. And I always thought that one time in my life when I give birth, I'll be very happy that I have these hips. And now this doctor is telling me that no, you're going to end up having a C-section. So after I probably called my husband crying, I'm sure I did. At that time, I was pregnant, very emotional. Um, I was taking a prenatal yoga class at the time. Loved it. It was awesome. Um, Funny story. Side note, one day, so we were living in LA at the time. So this was in an area, I think it was called Abbot Kinney. There was a yoga studio there. One day I was sitting there setting up my map, and Drew Barrymore shows up pregnant, puts her mat next to mine. And I'm sitting there like, does anyone else notice this famous actress sitting in our class? They all seem kind of used to it, all the other ladies. And she even said like, "Oh, hi." And I was like, "Hi." Like, "Oh my God, you're Drew Barrymore." Anyways, aside from that, in that yoga class, you always kind of like introduce yourself and say how many weeks pregnant you were. So then at that point, I had said, oh, my doctor just said he's breech and I'm going to have a C-section. These women all knew like every granola, every crunchy doctor there is. And they were like, you've got to see this chiropractor. He will flip your baby, like do this, So they sent me there. It took me a couple weeks before I was like, oh my gosh, am I really going to do this? I did end up going to the chiropractor. Very interesting. The procedure they do for trying to get a baby to flip is they massage your hip flexors. And by massage, that sounds pleasant. This is not pleasant. It is like rubbing them so hard. It is like the most painful thing. Like, I think they did 10 times on each hip flexor, but like with their thumb, and they just got in there and like pushed on it to loosen up your ligaments. I guess that's the trick. Um, at one point, the woman doing it was like, oh, wow, you're going to do great in labor because you've got great pain tolerance. And I'm like, thank you. Thanks. This hurts so bad. At one point, I did feel Ronin kind of move, but not flipped. So I also there's a website called flippingbabies.com, and it was talking about all these ways that you can get breech babies to flip. One of them being lay with your hips elevated. So I did that every day for like 15, 20, whatever amount of time. We started singing Turn Around to the baby, like turn around. That didn't work. At one point I was told that I had low fluids. So I was drinking gallons and gallons of water. But as the weeks went on and he was not turning, it became more and more clear that I was going to have a C-section. My doctor did offer to do an inversion where you go to the hospital and they physically, like, they put their hands on your belly and they'll like try to physically turn the baby from the exterior. The chances of like breaking your water doing that was kind of high, and you would have to do it at like 37 weeks. So there was a chance that you would deliver at 37 weeks. And I was just like, oh, well, that seemed too much. So it got to the point where it was far enough along where I was like, he's not turning. We're probably going to have a C-section. So fortunately for me, I had time to look up like how to recover from a C-section, how to prepare for one. And I got like more comfortable with the idea of having a C-section instead of having that like emergency where you're going into labor and then, oops, sorry, you're having a C-section right now. So I at least felt fortunate that I had a chance to prepare. It was very odd though when they were like, okay, call the hospital and find out when they have availability at 39 weeks. Because they were not going to let me go to my due date. So I think they scheduled it for April 26th. And I like had this weird feeling of like, I can't believe we're picking his birthday. Like, what if he wasn't meant to be born in April? His due date was in May. And that felt really weird. And then week of, they called me and my doctor was like, hey, we have a cancellation on Friday. So I'm going to move your C-section to Friday, April 25th. And I was like, wait, what? Like we can just change this? Like, oh, okay, see you on Friday. It's just a very odd situation. It feels very weird to have it all like scheduled out like that. So at that point, I had never had a contraction. I was getting a lot of those Braxton Hicks, but no, like never went into labor. On that Friday morning, got to take a shower, did my hair, put some makeup on. We drive to the hospital, which is so weird because you're like, okay, we're driving to have our baby. When we got to the hospital, the nurse there was like checking us in. She's like, okay, so you must be my 8 o'clock appointment. And I'm like, yes, I'm the 8 o'clock appointment. So weird. So the C-section was pretty standard, I think. Everything just feels weird when you're having a C-section. Like the lights are really bright. The room is really cold. You can't have your husband in there when you're getting your spinal. But I think it was a very routine C-section. They had extra doctors in there because he was breech, but everything came out fine. He was just stuck in that position. And they did say the water fluid was low. So that's probably one of the reasons why. I did feel extremely out of it having a C-section. Like I remember it all, but it was all very blurry, very like fuzzy. At some point after I delivered, maybe 2 hours later, my parents came to visit, and I have vague memories of that, but not anything really clear. Um, I did not breastfeed him until I got back to like the recovery room, and I didn't even know I could say, "Hey, can I do skin to skin right after he's born?" I didn't know that. So that was kind of like weird. Like she was finally probably like an hour after I had delivered, like, "Oh, are you planning on breastfeeding?" And I was like, "Yeah," like I'm in such a daze right now. So it was a little bit different in that sense. Like I felt like I was out of it, but it did everything. Everyone was healthy. Like I was okay, baby was okay. I did have some high blood pressure issues like that first night, first 2 days, which was a little scary. Um, and just getting out of bed with a C-section, so hard. So hard to do anything. At one point, I felt okay to take a shower. I think it was on like day 3. We stayed the max amount of time in the hospital. My husband was so ready to leave, and I was like, I can't leave yet. But I remember taking a shower and then trying to pull up my granny fishnet underwear. And I like legit couldn't do it. I could not bend down to do it because of the C-section. And so I had to ask my husband, like, can you help me get this big pad and fishnet underwear up? And at one point, like he left the room and I looked back at the mirror and I saw my butt. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe he saw this. This is horrible. This is not sexy fishnet. This is horrible. But we were able to go home, healthy baby, everything fine. 3 years later, I get pregnant again with my middle, Jet. And so my original doctor that I had with Ronin, she had said, because he was breech, there was nothing stopping you otherwise from going into labor naturally. So if you wanted to have a VBAC, that is something I would support. We ended up moving to Orange County after that. So I had to find a different doctor. And I ended up finding the same OBGYN gynecologist that I had before moving up to LA. So I went back to her, and she was super supportive also of VBACs. A few people I had told after having Ronin, like, oh, I'm hoping one day to, have a natural birth. And they all said, oh, no, 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 you're not allowed to. Once you have a C-section, you cannot do a vaginal birth. So I was kind of like, I hope my doctor lets me. It was just something I wanted to experience. I wanted to know what it feels like, which now I'm like, wish I didn't feel that, but it was just, I'm a woman. I wanted to know what it feels like to actually give birth vaginally. So this doctor was actually very supportive. From day one, she just said, we can give it a shot if you go into labor naturally and you can do it, great. You basically have to sign your life away. You have to sign a paper saying, like, if anything happens, it's my fault, not the doctor's. But that pregnancy, I worked out a lot. I was doing a boot camp. I don't know how I did this. I was like lifting weights and doing squats and on the rowing machine. And I think I was like actually jogging until I was like 25, 30 weeks pregnant. I don't know how I did it. Now I can barely run a mile. But I stayed pretty active during that pregnancy. So funny thing was I was 39 weeks pregnant, exactly the same as when I had Ronin. So he was born at 39 weeks through C-section. With Jet, I went into labor naturally at 39 weeks. And the funny thing is, I just had it in my head that because the last one was like earlier than I went into labor, I never went into labor. I thought, oh, I will make it to my due date. Like that's just what happens, right? So my friend and I actually took our kids to a children's museum that was like 2.5 hours away, 2 days before I went into labor. And we look back now and we're like, oh my God, why did you go so far from the hospital when you were like so close to delivering? I don't know why I did it. I don't know, you know, we just wanted to get the kids out of the house. It was fun. We were together. But yes, I did do that 2 days before I gave birth. So it was Sunday night. I remember we went swimming on Sunday. Sunday night, like 1 in the morning, I started feeling contractions and I was like, oh my God, like is this what is really happening? Is this happening right now? So for a couple hours, I just like let it be. I was like, okay, I'm having contractions. And finally in the morning, I told my husband, I was like, I think I might be in labor. So for the next, I don't know, 5, 6 hours, kept laboring at home, got to the point where I was like, I think I need my mom to take Ronin. I think this is maybe the real thing. But no, it never got close enough where I felt like we need to go to the hospital. They were never like super consistent. It was like 5 minutes apart. I think you were supposed to be 3 minutes apart, whatever. At one point, I had a big contraction and then I thought I peed myself. Turns out my water actually broke, but I did not realize that. And I thought I was peeing myself. So that was fun. But it was still another, like, oh gosh, maybe 9 hours before I actually went into the hospital. And it was in the evening. And I'm like, things are not changing. They have been exactly the same all day. I'm having contractions all day long. They're not getting closer, but they're still strong enough for like me to stop what I'm doing. So let's just go to the hospital and get it checked out. To this day, I don't know why I never called my doctor during the day to say, hey, this is what's happening. What should I do? I don't know. You just get in the zone and you do your thing. I don't know. So we get to the hospital. It takes forever to check in and you're doing this and I'm still getting really bad contractions. They check me and they realize, oh, hey, your water broke. So yeah, they can't do anything to induce me. But they were going to admit me. They couldn't check to see how far along I was. That's what it was. Because they were like, your water broke, so we don't want to check and see how dilated you are. Um, so then we're in the hospital. It's like middle of the night. Now I'm getting super tired. And I eventually get my epidural and like finally I can sleep. Then earlier in that morning, they were like, okay, we need to now check you. So they did check me, and I think I was at like a 5. So here I am. I'm like 24 plus hours into labor and still at a 5, which was so discouraging because I'm like, oh my God, this has been going on forever. Took forever. So it was still long, long, long time. I had to wait. I think the total amount of time I was in labor was like 36 hours, maybe. Um, it got to the point where I finally got to a 10. I think what happened was I finally started like rotating in bed. I was kind of just laying there because I was so tired and so uncomfortable. And then when you have the epidural, you're just like, I'm numb anyways. But I was able to like move around a little bit at one point, and that I think got me to a 10. So then it was time to push, and I don't know what I'm doing because I've never done this before. The epidural really kicked in, so I could not feel anything, which was a good thing. I don't mind that I didn't feel anything. Um, but when it came time to push, they would say, okay, on the next contraction, push. And I would. And they were like, it's not doing anything. You're not like doing anything. One thing that was so weird was one of the nurses said, oh, when you're pushing, keep your eyes open. And I was like, that feels so unnatural. Like, I just want to like just close my eyes and push. And she was like, no, 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 keep your eyes open, relax your face. So that just totally threw me off. Fast forward to my third birth, I didn't do that. And it was like way easier. So trust your gut because it was just very odd to try and do that. Well, so as I'm pushing, Jet's heart rate starts going down. And then they start getting concerned that if they don't get him out soon, they don't like what they're seeing. So every time I'd have a contraction and push, his heart rate would go down. And then when I would stop, it would go back to normal. So what they had me do was push for contraction and then wait a contraction. So don't push and then push for the next one, which was hard because my contractions were still about 3 minutes apart. So it wasn't like they were super, super close together. So there was a lot of time in between like pushing and waiting. At one point, we were maybe an hour plus in. They said, if you can't get him out soon, we're either going to suction or you'll have to have another C-section. And I was like, get the suction out. I'm ready to have this baby out. Get him out. I don't want another C-section. Not that that would have been the end of the world, but it was just something I really wanted to do. So finally, we got to the point where I was able to push him out. And I would say that watching the clock was not a good option for me. I should not have done that because every time I looked at the clock, I kept thinking, this is taking a long time. Why isn't this going faster? I have friends that said 2 pushes and they got their kid out. Why is this taking me so long? But again, it was my first vaginal birth. Turns out Jet has a huge head even to this day. So I think that had something to do with it. And maybe he just wasn't right in the right quite position and it just took a lot to get him out. But he ended up being born vaginally. I was so happy. The aftermath of a vaginal birth is not so pleasant either. I ended up having a 3rd-degree tear, which I mean, I was numb, so I didn't feel anything. They sew you up. You have your normal recovery where you feel like everything's bruised, everything's swollen, but it wasn't as bad as it sounds. It didn't, I mean, you hear 3rd-degree tear and you're like, oh my gosh, that must be awful. It was a recovery. I recovered from it. The greatest part was I felt like I could get up and walk that day. Whereas with the C-section, it was like 24 hours in, I was like, I can't even get out of bed to like try to go to the bathroom. It was so hard. Laughing hurt, coughing hurt, rolling over in bed hurt. Whereas the C-section, other than being like swollen, sore, you're feeling more normal. Like I felt like I could take a shower normally. After having Jet, I think I was able to go to the park within a week. I remember we were home in, a short amount of time. I think we stayed 2 days there at the hospital, but I was able to take Ronin to the park. It felt easier to get up and around. With the C-section, you are not allowed to lift anything heavier than your baby. So the thought of taking your car seat with your baby is very scary. Like, I can't carry this car seat. How am I going to go places? So definitely having a VBAC with a second and having a 3-year-old at home was a blessing. Just so you know, also, my 3rd birth was a vaginal birth also. So I guess you would call that like my 2nd VBAC. The doctor, again, was super supportive of it. This labor was a lot easier. I ended up not going into labor. I just like had preterm labor for like a week straight every night thinking tonight's going to be the night. Tonight's going to be the night. Never went into labor. So at 41 weeks, I was induced. I had the Foley ball, the Pitocin. So I pretty much felt it all. I've done everything. But with him, I pushed him out in 2 pushes. So who knows? Like each birth is so different. But what I will say, if you have had a C-section, that is your birth story. That is what you were meant to have. If you are interested in a VBAC, absolutely find a doctor that will support you, or like just ask around and find out if that is an option for you. Because I feel very lucky that I was able to do that after having the C-section. I'm not sure what 2 more surgeries would have been like for my body, but I do feel like I recovered just fine from all 3 births. So if you are interested in a C-section if you're interested in a VBAC, that is doable. It is possible. And there is lots of support for you. The podcast that I was on is a podcast just for VBAC stories, and it is fabulous. It's called the VBAC Link, and they also have a website that you can go to, and they are doulas to help support women with VBAC. So if you're thinking about it, it's a great place to turn. So I hope you liked the story. I don't think I've ever really shared much about my birth stories. And I think the fact that women can have VBACs is something that should be shared. So I hope you enjoyed that. And I hope you're all surviving this summer right now. I am doing okay. But I look forward to our weekly chats, and I will have another one out for you next week. So in the meantime, reminder that everyone burns their first pancake, so just keep flipping.